then be inserted into the program.
Recorded.
The World Tomorrow. The Worldwide Church of God presents The World Tomorrow with Herbert W. Armstrong.
Preview coming up.
In the early days of video editing, the magnetic tapes were cut and spliced by hand. Today, all of this is done electronically with computerized editing equipment, and the end result is a more sophisticated product. In January 1984, 50 years after that first program was broadcast over a 100-watt station in Oregon, the World Tomorrow program is heard over 147 radio and 326 television stations around the world. David Hume, Director of Media Purchasing, works closely with Mr. Armstrong and one of the world's largest advertising agents, BBDO International. Their network of agencies, with over 100 offices in 36 countries and 72 cities, represents the Worldwide Church of God in purchasing media time and advertising space. In 1982, a version of the television program, subtitled in French, was broadcast by Radio Television Luxembourg and later by Television Monte Carlo. And then, in the first week of 1984, exactly 50 years after Mr. Armstrong began making regular programs, The World Tomorrow was beamed with Italian subtitles to the people of Italy. Every Sunday morning on over 200 stations around the United States, Mr. Armstrong announces the Watts line number, by which listeners and viewers can telephone their requests for literature directly. Dozens of operators are standing by. So great is the response that extra lines have had to be installed. An all-time record of 13,873 calls were received in response to the telecast Revelation, Catastrophic Event, aired on the weekend of January 21st, 22nd, 1984. It would not be possible to process the thousands of requests for Plain Truths and other literature without the modern equipment in the mail processing department. Operators at computer terminals can process the millions of requests for literature each year while still maintaining the individual attention that Mr. Armstrong has always insisted on since the days that he and Mrs. Armstrong worked together in the little office in Eugene. The second part of the three-point plan was to publish a magazine. By 1932, Mr. Armstrong had had years of experience in advertising. He knew the power of the printed word. He had learned how to grab the reader's attention with a striking headline and to write compelling copy that would drive home the message. Experience would now be put to work to produce the world's most important magazine, The Plain Truth. But there was no money to produce a printed magazine. So Mr. and Mrs. Armstrong bought a second-hand Neo-style and duplicated the first issues by hand. In February 1934, The Plain Truth made its modest bow. For the first issue, 250 copies were duplicated. By November 1958, circulation had reached 175,000. July 1967, the 1 million mark was passed. Worldwide circulation in 1973 stood at more than 3 million copies. And now, in February 1984, after 50 years of publication, The Plain Truth has a circulation of 6.4 million worldwide. If each page of the February issue alone were laid end to end, it would nearly stretch around the earth at the equator. Placing these magazines one on top of the other would make a stack taller than Mount Everest. Printed in 7 languages, English, German, French, Spanish, Dutch, Italian, and Norwegian, the plain truth is circulated in 203 countries and territories on 6 continents. The various editions are printed in 7 locations around the world: Canada, England, Australia, New Zealand, Zimbabwe, South Africa, and the United States. Truly, it is a worldwide magazine of understanding. In 1934, the first issue was printed on a second-hand neo-style. Today, the U.S. edition is printed at R.R. Donnelley & Sons, one of the largest commercial printers in the world. The Glasgow, Kentucky plant, where the plain truth is printed, covers 417,000 square feet, larger than 7 football fields. It employs 1,100 employees and runs 3 8-hour shifts around the clock, 7 days a week. In commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the Plain Truth, Editor-in-Chief Herbert W. Armstrong flew to Glasgow, Kentucky to observe the printing of the special anniversary issue. Mr. Armstrong, who has been involved with the publishing business since 1908, then took a tour of the press facilities. There are 13 mammoth presses at the Glasgow plant, towering 2 to 3 stories high. The huge rolls of paper, weighing from 3/4 of a ton to 2 1/4 tons, feed the massive web presses. In order to keep the presses running continuously, a second roll of paper is fused by the automatic splicer to the top roll as it runs out. The paper is printed on both sides simultaneously as it races through the press at 16 miles per hour. Each of the 4 colors used in printing, yellow, magenta, cyan, and black, are added separately. The magazine is printed in 3 16-page sections or signatures with a separate full-page cover. The signatures are then stacked to go to the bindery, where the magazine is collated, assembled, trimmed, and wire-stitched. At the bindery, Mr. Armstrong was presented with the first 3 copies off the press. In order to protect the cover of the special anniversary issue, the magazine was sealed in clear plastic wrappers. As part of the tour, Mr. Armstrong also visited the shipping area, where the plain truth is sent out by large truckloads, a long way from the beginning days when he and his wife Loma could carry an entire month's issue in their arms across the street to the post office. An illustration of the growth of the plain truth came when Mr. Armstrong stood before the 360 tons of paper used to print 1 month's edition, the equivalent of 20 acres of renewable forest. When the paper is brought to the plant by train, it takes 10 large boxcars to deliver it. After the tour, there was a dinner at the Donnelley facility. There, Robert Myers, Vice President of Magazine Sales Worldwide for R.R. Donnelley & Sons, honored Mr. Armstrong with a special presentation. The third part of the original 3-point program was personal campaigns. Little could Mr. Armstrong have realized that these small public meetings in the towns and cities of Oregon would one day lead him to stand before kings and leaders of great nations and to preach the gospel of the kingdom of God to large audiences in cities many thousands of miles away from the peaceful Willamette Valley.
And today, you know that several nations, several smaller nations, have nuclear weapons. And they could start it, and it would go to Russia and the United States and the big nations, and finally there wouldn't be any humanity left. Most of us are asleep, and we don't realize what's going on all over the world. Why do we have these problems? Why these troubles? But just before this passage in Matthew 24 that I told you about, verse 14 says that when this gospel of the kingdom is proclaimed